Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel for my favorite video to record for the year. Technically this video is for last year, but due to the never-ending illness, it took me until now to record it. But this is my favorite 10 books of 2022. I read a total of 119 books in 2022, and it was easy to pick some of them. Like, I feel like the first 5 or so that I listed, I was just like, yes, these are automatically my favorites. I know that I enjoyed these more than I enjoyed anything else. But then I had a really long list of books that I loved, books that I enjoyed reading so much, and it was really difficult to parse that down. And I think part of the problem is that I want people to read the books that I really loved. So the books that I gave like 4.5 stars or 5 stars, the books that I had such a fun time reading, I really want other people to read. But not all of the books can end up on this list. So I have done my best to put them on and also to rank them from 10th to 1st place. And I did not do the rule of you can only have one book per author or one book per series, because some of the books that I loved the most this year were by the same author. And some of the books I loved the most this year were in the same series. And I wanted to talk about all of them. So that is that. I loved all these books and we will get right into it. Number 10 on the list is a book that I read relatively recently. This one was from the fall, and that is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. This was a book that had been on my TBR for a while, and everybody that I talked to who really knows my reading taste and knows what I like to read thought that I was really going to enjoy this one, and they were absolutely right. I'm not really going to go into summaries for these books, but because I have talked about them all in like various wrap-ups and those kinds of things, but I'm just going to try to articulate why these books meant so much to me. So what I enjoyed about Piranesi is, number one, it was unlike any other reading experience I've ever had. And if I reflect on my favorite books and the books that I have the most fun reading, that is something that a lot of them have in common. It started all the way back when I read The Gunslinger for the very first time. And since that moment, anything that is weird and wonderful and feels really different from any other book is something that usually does a good job of capturing my heart. So Piranesi is a very strange, atmospheric, whimsical book. It is not super plot heavy. It is very character focused. It is very short. I absolutely recommend it. Even if you don't like it, you will probably know that within like 5 or 10 pages. So I encourage anybody to check it out, and hopefully you will have the same kind of reading experience that I did. After Piranesi, we have Tagana by Guy Gavriel Kay. So I had said in Discord that I was going to be recording this video, and so some people were speculating on which books might make the list, might not make the list. And I don't think that this is one that people necessarily expected to be on here, because it was not maybe one of the books I was the most effusive about over the course of the year. It is not the book that I raved about the most, but it is one of the books that has stuck with me the most throughout 2022. It is one of the books that I go back and think about the most. It is one of the best fantasy standalones that I have ever read. It has absolutely gorgeous prose. It has catapulted Guy Gavriel Kay to the top of my want to read list. I cannot wait to explore more of his backlog. But what I think makes Tagana so special is that it is absolutely immersive. Guy Gavriel Kay builds up a landscape using artistic world building. So he tells us about the music of this land, about the artwork, about the wine, about the food, about how the pieces of a country make up a cultural identity and what that means to people and what it means for people if they lose that, and what that can take away from a person and how that can impact them and change them. This is a beefy book, and I think it needs to be chunky in order to work well as a standalone, but in the number of pages that he has, Guy Gavriel Kay develops some excellent characters and gives us one of the most nuanced and interesting villains that I have ever read. This has an absolutely amazing ending. I think that it is an excellent excellent ending. It is perfect for the book. And while this isn't a perfect book, it is a stellar read. If you have not read Tagana, then I cannot recommend it highly enough. And just overall, even if you don't want to start with Tagana, I would recommend trying something by Guy Gavriel Kay, because this man's writing is almost unparalleled in terms of the fantasy landscape. Just absolutely beautiful, beautiful writing. After that, we go up to number 8. And speaking of beautiful stories and beautiful conclusions, this was probably my favorite ending to a series ever, and that is The Price of Spring by Daniel Abraham. The other book, or the third book in this series, An Autumn War, also was so close to making this top 10. I absolutely loved that book as well. But this is the final volume in the Long Price Quartet by Daniel Abraham, which is... I've been trying to find the best way to describe what this book is, because it is not necessarily a multi-generational tale, though it does span generations of time, but it is a fantasy story where we follow two main characters over a lifetime. So it is a lifetime spanning fantasy story. There are 4 books and they're all roughly spaced 15 years apart. So we follow these main characters from the time that they are young men until they are old men. And no other fantasy author has done that in this way that I have read. And Daniel Abraham creates 2 of the most realistic characters that I have read in fantasy. He gives you main characters who are flawed, but not flawed as in, because I think authors in general have gotten better. They want to move away from the idea of a fantasy Mary Sue. They want to give us characters that feel realistic, that have positive qualities and negative qualities. But these characters, Daniel Abraham gives them characteristics and has them do things that feel so lifelike in the way that they are frustrating. That these decisions are bad and they impact the characters' entire lives. And there's no getting out of that, because we are following these characters for a lifetime. And so we have to see their lifetime consequences for their actions. And it's so well done. It is... The world building in this book is excellent. The magic that is used in this book is so interesting. And Daniel Abraham just pushes the story in directions that I did not expect it to go. I think he pushes the boundaries in a lot of ways that many authors would be afraid to do. And what has ended up is he's written a really niche novel. So there is a reason why The Long Price Quartet is not one of those like giant books on BookTube or in the fantasy realm where everybody's reading it, everybody should read it. I personally think everybody should read it and everybody should give it a try, but this is mature fantasy at its greatest. It is about how we live our lives and the mistakes that we make and the things that we do right and how we can try our best and still fail and what that means for us long term. It forces you to reflect a lot on your choices and the goals that you have for your life, and it's just a book that will make you think and will keep you thinking long after you have finished it. The Long Price Quartet is a book series that I think I will reread throughout my life, because I think I'll take different things out of it now in my 30s versus in my 50s versus at the end of my life. I just think that it is something special in fantasy and absolutely one of my favorite reads of all time, not just of this year. After that, we have A Little Hatred by Joe Abercrombie. So I questioned where I was going to put this in the ranking. I wasn't sure where it was going to end up on the list, but I have settled here. And this is number... Oh, sorry, I skipped over. So it actually isn't A Little Hatred. So spoiler, I will talk about A Little Hatred right now, but that is actually number 6. We'll go back to number 7 afterwards. I mean, it wouldn't be my video if I didn't do something silly in it, but A Little Hatred by Joe Abercrombie is the first book in the Age of Madness trilogy. It is a book series that I wasn't even supposed to start in 2022. I was supposed to leave it for 2023. And in December, I wasn't feeling well and I had a lot of things to do to get ready for the holidays. So I didn't have a lot of time for physical reading and I listened to a lot of audiobooks. And I happened to have this audiobook. And once I turned it on, I could not stop. I loved it. I have been in such a Joe Abercrombie mood lately, and I was not let down by this at all. This is a continuation of his First Law trilogy. It's where we start to see some modernization in the First Law universe. And I have to admit, I didn't say this to anybody before starting, but I was a little skeptical about the Age of Madness because the idea of a fantasy land modernizing is not something that I thought I would enjoy. I like the old-fashioned feeling. I like swords and shields over gunpowder and cannons and muskets and those kinds of things. So I thought maybe this is moving away from something that I really like into something that I'm not as keen on. But I shouldn't have worried because I honestly think that Joe Abercrombie can do no wrong for me. I love so many things about his writing. I love his characters. I love his wit. I love his style. I love his action sequences, just the way that he writes, the characters he crafts. I think that they are excellent, and he always makes me laugh. The way that he juxtaposes the bleak with the bleakly funny, it just works really well for me. I am not the biggest grimdark fan. I need that edge of humor with the grimmest of stories. And I think that's why Abercrombie works so well for me, because I enjoy the realism that grimdark brings, but I don't want to like nosedive right into nihilism, or I don't want it to send me off into some sort of existential crisis. I'm fine examining the darker shades of humanity. Like, I'm under no illusions about what people are like, but I want to have that edge of humor with the story, and Abercrombie certainly delivers on that. So I loved this story, really enjoyed some of the new characters. I'm thinking I'm going to have a new favorite character in the First Law universe, but we'll give it some more time throughout the trilogy and see how that settles in. But super glad that I started this, and I would be shocked if other books from this series didn't end up on my best of 2023 list. Now we're going to go backwards because I can't read. In all fairness, it is a very tiny printing. I'll show you at the end. I don't want to spoil anything now, but it is written in really small font. But number 7 was actually Battleground by Jim Butcher. So this is the most recent full-length novel in the Dresden Files series. And 2022 was really the year of Dresden Files for me. I had read books 1 through 10 before 2022, or maybe 1 through 11, 2022. And then I started with book 12 in 2022 and read through the rest of the series in quick sequence and absolutely fell in love with Dresden. It has catapulted up my list of favorite fantasy series. It is definitely in the top 3. They're just so entertaining, and I love long series where you can form these connections with the characters. I really enjoy series like The Long Price Quartet, for example, that I just talked about, where the characters feel so vibrant and alive, and the author does such a good job of making you feel for them. But there's nothing that can endear you to a character more than spending such a long time with them. And by the time we get to Battleground, we have spent, 18 books with Harry Dresden and all of his friends. So they feel like family. They feel so important. And it's really hard, if you're enjoying a series, not to fall in love with the characters after that much time. And Battleground, for me, was just a breakneck, absolute firecracker of a book. I loved it. Vlogging my experience of reading Battleground is probably one of my favorite things that I have done since joining YouTube, and it was just absolutely phenomenal. I know that this is not a book for everyone. It is very action focused. The entire book is essentially one giant battle, but for my taste, I think that Jim Butcher pulls us back just long enough to feel some of the kind of emotional repercussions of what's happening in the story. And it was just entertaining. He just keeps outdoing himself from book to book and from scene to scene in this book. And that emotional roller coaster, I was just living for it. So absolutely adored Battleground, and it had to be on this list. We will jump now from 7, which is what Battleground was, up to 5. And number 5 is Red Country by Joe Abercrombie. So when I was first starting to talk about A Little Hatred, this is what I meant. I didn't know if I was going to put Red Country above A Little Hatred or below. And I think I still enjoyed Red Country like a teeny tiny bit more, just because aesthetically, or I guess like atmospherically, I enjoy the Western setting more than I enjoy that kind of like flintlocky setting that we're moving into with the Age of Madness. I'm sure, excuse me, based on the things that were built up in A Little Hatred, I will probably end up enjoying the Age of Madness overall more than I enjoyed any of the individual standalones. But if we're just talking purely one book, so far, I think Red Country is my favorite Abercrombie novel, and I know that is not the most popular opinion, but everything about it did it for me. I loved the main character, Shy. It was great to follow a female main character for one of Abercrombie's books. Not that we did follow Manza in Best Served Cold, but I just loved the Western aesthetic. Some of the cameos that happened in this book were amazing. I just loved everything about it. I've already talked about it a million times on the channel, so I probably don't need to go into that many details, but it reignited my like Abercrombie fever and had me reading through all the rest of the books in short sequence, and I'm sure that I will finish The Age of Madness in the first quarter of 2023 because it is really all that I want to be reading right now. And then we are going into the top 4. So book number 4 on this list is Shield of Thunder by David Gemmell. The other books in this series, Lord of the Silver Bow, and the last one's called The Fall of Kings. I can't actually remember what book 3 is called, but they were certainly in my, like, if we're going to do like top 20 books of the year, they would definitely make it. It's just that I think that the middle book here is the best of the bunch. This is the middle book of David Gemmell's Troy trilogy, and it just cemented for me that David Gemmell was really a master of heroic fantasy. If you like heroic fantasy, and what I mean by that is fantasy where you're going to lean into those classic tropes a little bit more. You're definitely going to see some stratification between good and evil. There will certainly be like good guys and bad guys, and they will not be that difficult to spot. If you want like high emotional stakes, if you want big like bombastic fights and gestures, those are the things that I get out of heroic fantasy. And I wouldn't want everything that I read to be that, but I want some of the things that I read to be that. And when it's done well, which for me is like the John Gwynns of the world, then it's so much fun. And to me, this is Gemmell at his best. This book, Shield of Thunder, it just like blew away so many of the books that I read this year. It brought out all of the emotions. I loved the characters. Andromache, who is one of the main characters of the trilogy, one of my favorite female fantasy characters ever. She is amazing. I love her. She is vulnerable and tough, and she is so strong, and just, I love it. Gemmell is able to combine like the feminine parts of her with some of the strengths that are classically seen as male, and I think he does like a good job of melding those two, and I really loved her as a character. I loved a couple of the new characters that were introduced in this book, and I thought that the found family aspect or the friendships that were built up in this book were really enjoyable. And it was just like, I find that heroic fantasy and classic fantasy in general can be a little bit more emotional than more modern fantasy because they do rely on some of those tropes. And sometimes it can become a bit melodramatic, but for me, David Gemmell like really towed the line here. I think it was perfectly balanced, and it was just an excellent book. I loved reading this trilogy, but I especially loved Shield of Thunder. And then we get in to the top 3. So number 3 on this list is the one work of nonfiction that made it to my favorites of the year, and that is the book Bitch on the Female of the Species. So this is a book that, again, I gushed about. I gushed about it in my wrap-up when I was on the Fantasy Network with Jimmy Nuts. I gushed about it there. I have basically talked about this to anybody who would listen. And what it is it's by Lucy Cook, who's a female biologist. She works in the field of evolutionary biology. And she does a lot of research that combines evolutionary biology with kind of her own feminist ideals and thoughts. And what this book was about uncovering basically what is like a gender data gap in biological science. So it talks about evolutionary biology and just biological research and how the female of many species ends up getting overlooked. So we hear a lot about like adaptations and sexual dimorphism and how the characteristics that male animals have will help them find a mate and secure a mate and continue the genetic line. And research has overlooked the role that female animals have to play, and it's really fascinating. So I think despite the fact that this is clearly like a very big passion project for Lucy Cook, I felt like the research was balanced. I think that she did a good job of executing her points and making sure that she backed up her points with evidence while also just making it an interesting and engaging read. I love evolutionary biology, and I love reading about women and data gaps and how your sex or gender can influence the data that we are given, where science does well and where we don't do well. Like, those are all things that I'm interested in. So all of them combined to make a book that was basically tailor-made for me. I am willing to concede that more than any other book on this list, this is one that is going to be attuned to some people's tastes and not others. Like, this is definitely not going to be a hit book for everyone, but it was one of my favorite reading experiences ever. I will absolutely read and or listen to this again. Anyone in my life who is interested in this topic will be recommended this book. I am so glad that I got to read it this year. And then we are moving on. So my number 2 book of the year, this is probably going to come as a surprise to almost everyone. I don't think everyone, like there are some people who are not going to be surprised by this, but for most people, the number 2 book on my list of favorites for 2022 is The Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation by MXTX. And the reason that this might be a surprise is I have reviewed individual volumes on my channel, and I have been positive about those volumes, but they've ranged in rating from anywhere from like a 3.5 to a 4.5, and I don't think I've given any individual volume 5 stars. But even though the volumes are being released in English right now, I look at this as a full story. The chapters don't even reset in every book. Like if you end one book on chapter 31, like the next book will begin with chapter 32. This in my mind is one big story. And in 2022, I was able to read it in its entirety. The final English translations have not been released yet, so I will continue to read those as they are released and review them and do, a big review at the end. But this is the year that I first read the story in its entirety. And it is not an exaggeration to say that it's taken over my life. Like, I love this story. And it appeals to the part of me that is like a fanish person, the person who is involved in like fan fiction and, fandom discussions and fandom spaces. So this is a little bit outside of the rest of the books on this list because it definitely, it is that kind of phenomenon. It is a book that pulls in people who love to exist in those fanish spaces. And I love it. I have read this book. I've read and reread the volumes that have been released. I watched the live action show. I watched the donghua. I read the manhwa panels that are released online. I read like so much fan fiction. This has just become like part of my everyday life. And I don't talk about that a ton on the channel because that's not really what the channel exists to talk about. But if we were talking about pure enjoyment, love for a stories that have had the biggest impact on me in 2022, Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation is absolutely one of those. It has introduced me to MXTX's works in general. I also loved her series, Scum Villain Self-Saving System. It did not make my top 10 of the year, but I still think that it was an excellent series. I'm reading her final series right now, and I just love her work. I love this style of Asian-inspired fantasy with cultivation and that kind of spiritual magic. I love the swordplay. I love the politics. I love the layered stories. It's really interesting to read books that have been translated from another language because you will find patterns and tropes and nuances that you don't see in books that were written and then published in English. So it has been eye-opening in that way, and I am just really, really thankful that these books have been translated and that I have been able to experience them. So if you are at all interested in any of those things, noting that this is a very romance-heavy story, which I know is not something that everybody who watches this channel loves, but if you do enjoy fantasy romance and you are interested in any of those things, I cannot recommend this series highly enough. I absolutely love it. And then we get to my number one book of the year, which is probably going to be a surprise to zero people, unlike the number two book of the year, and that is Changes by Jim Butcher. And I'm just imagining like Alan or someone watching this video and like rolling their eyes at the fact that Changes is my number one book of the year, but I can't help it. Like it's such a weird position to be put in, because whenever you start Dresden, everybody will say, just wait till you get to Changes. Wait till you get to Changes. Like, they say it so much that it does become frustrating as someone who is new into the series, because you think, like, how good can this book be? Like, there's no way. It has now been overhyped, and there's no way that it can live up to it. I am not going to like this book as much as everybody else. And at least in my case, I absolutely liked it as much as everyone else. It was not overhyped. It's appropriately hyped because it is amazing. It does completely shift the landscape of Dresden. It does open up the story in totally new ways that you have not experienced or foreseen or even thought of before. It gives you so much to think about as you move forward with the Dresden Files. And it's just fun. It does all the things that Jim Butcher does well, he does best in Changes. The pacing is spot on. The action sequences are amazing. The emotional beats are so high and so low. It is, if you love Dresden, I think you will love Changes. I'm not saying that everyone is going to love Changes or that everyone's feelings about Dresden are going to be shifted by Changes. But if you love this series, I cannot imagine you not enjoying this book. It showcases some of Butcher's capabilities to their absolute maximum, and it is just a romp. Like, it is so fun. It is so stressful to be reading it. It is so emotional. Like, this book will leave you in turmoil and in the best possible way. So I cannot think of a reading experience that impacted me more, that was more enjoyable, that was more difficult than Changes. And I am so happy that BookTube led me to push on and persevere with the Dresden Files, because it is a series that I absolutely love now. And I cannot wait to reread some of my favorites, but also get to read new content within this universe. So that's it. Those are my 10 favorite books from 2022. I know it's a little bit late coming out, but hopefully it was still enjoyable. I know everyone must be sick of answering this same question from all of the booktubers that they watch, but I would really love to know what your favorite book or books of the year were, and I will see you with another video soon. Bye!